Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read aloud of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. His last great novel, the story of a wealthy landowner named Mr. Scarborough, who's dying and knows he is, not sure how many days he has left on Earth, but he has decided that he wants to bequeath his property the way he wants to, and not the way the law says he has to. The law says it has to go to his eldest son, Montjoy. But Montjoy is a proud man, an unyielding man, and also an inveterate gambler who has racked up lots and lots of unpayable debts, including post obits, in other words, promises of repayment to his debtors on the death of his father. Father knows this and has decided this is a lost cause and declares his son illegitimate before the world. And therefore, the post obits mean nothing. The debts look to settle on their own. No one has any claim to the estate. The younger son, Augustus, is the heir. It turns out he's the legitimate heir. He's the legitimate firstborn. That's how chapter 1 ends. It ends with Montjoy Scarborough. He might be a rough, coarse man, but we feel a little sympathy for him because it seems like he has not a friend in the world. In fact, we're told that once he learns this, he immediately leaves London for a bit of time. And now we get to chapter 2, and chapter 2 tells us that he isn't exactly friendless. There's one other person, the person he leaves London to go and see, to tell about this story. Chapter 2 is called Florence Mountjoy. And we're going to have to put up with a few things here. We will get to them as we go. This is chapter 2 of Mr. Scarborough's Family. Mr. Scarborough had a niece, one Florence Mountjoy, to whom it had been intended that Captain Scarborough should be married. So right out of the gate, we have two major quibbles here with this chapter. We'll also have something to appreciate, but we have two major quibbles, Victorian type things. One of them we'll get to in due time, but here's the first one, which is that Trollope thinks nothing of the fact that Mr. Scarborough wants first cousins to marry and have children. You just have to roll with that. That is just the way of it. There had been no considerations of money when the intention had first formed, for the lady was possessed of no more than £10,000, which would have been as nothing to the prospects of the captain when the idea was first entertained. Still a large amount of money. She's not an orphan bride. That's a large amount to settle on a wife. Think about, again, Pride and Prejudice and the settlements on the Bennet girls. That's £10,000 is vast compared to that. But Mr. Scarborough was fond of people who belonged to him. In this way, he had been much attached to his late brother-in-law, General Montjoy, and had perceived that his niece was beautiful and grateful, and was in every way desirable as one who might be made in part thus to belong to himself. Florence herself, when the idea of marriage was first suggested to her by her mother, was only 18, and received it with awe rather than with pleasure or abhorrence. To her cousin Montjoy has always been the most magnificent personages. He was only 7 years her senior, but he had early in life assumed the manners as he had also done the vices of mature age, and loomed large in the girl's eyes as a man of undoubted wealth and fashion. At that period, 3 years antecedent to his father's declaration, he had no doubt been much in debt, but his debts had not been generally known, and his father had still thought that a marriage with his cousin might serve to settle him, to use the phrase which was common with himself. From that day to this, the courtship had gone on, and the squire had taught himself to believe that the two cousins were all but engaged to each other. He had so considered it at any rate for 2 years, till during the last final year he had resolved to throw the captain overboard. And even during this year there had been periods of hope, for he had not finally made up his mind till but a short time before he had put it into practice. It's a very interesting little note. So this plan, in the face of these innumerable moneylenders and this mountain of debt, to declare Montjoy illegitimate and thereby dissolve it all and frustrate the moneylenders, that plan, it took Mr. Scarborough a long time to come to that plan. And once he'd come to it, it's fascinating. I would like to know, I wish we had an antecedent chapter on how he came to that plan and when he decided to do it and why. But we don't. No doubt he was fond of his niece in accordance with his own capability for fondness. He would caress her and stroke her hair, and took delight in having her near him. And of true love for such a girl his heart was quite capable. He was a good-natured, fearless, but not selfish man, to whom the fate in life of this poor girl was a matter of real concern. Trollope is fond of Mr. Scarborough. And his eldest son, who was by no means good-natured, had something of the same nature. He did truly love after his own fashion of loving. He would have married his cousin at any moment, with or without her £10,000, for of all human beings he was the most reckless. And yet in his breast was present a feeling of honor of which his father knew nothing. This is crucial. His father is thinking, well, what difference does it make? The mother, my wife, is dead. What difference is it going to make to her if I say that she had a child out of wedlock with me? What difference is it going to make to anybody now? She's past caring. And he thinks that since he feels that way, his son must feel that way. Never crosses his mind that Mountjoy might be wounded by that aspersion on his mother. When it was explained to him that his mother's fair name was to be aspersed, a mother whom he could but faintly remember, the threat did bring with it its own peculiar agony. But of this the squire neither felt nor knew anything. The lady had been long dead, and could be none the better or worse for aught that could be said of her. To the captain it was not so, and it was preferable to him to believe his father to be dishonest than his mother. He at any rate was in truth in love with his cousin Florence, and when the story was told to him, one of the first effects was the bearing which it would have upon her mind. It had been said that within 2 or 3 days after the communication he had left London. He had done so in order that he might at once go to Cheltenham to see his cousin. There Miss Mountjoy lived with her mother. It's a little confusing. His name is Mountjoy, her name is Mountjoy, but we'll persevere. The time had been when Florence Mountjoy had been proud of her cousin, and to tell the truth of her feelings, though she had never loved him, she had almost done so. Rumors had made their way through even to her condition in life, and she was, in her innocence, had gradually been taught to believe that Captain Scarborough was not a man she could be safe in loving. And there had, perhaps, come another, as to whom her feelings were different. He's oddly reticent about naming that other. I think because even at this point he knows what the next chapter is going to be called. She has no doubt at first thought that she would be willing to become her cousin's wife, but she had never said as much to herself, and now both her heart and mind were set against him. He doesn't know that. It's only when he makes the subject overt that he learns that. Captain Scarborough, as he went down to Cheltenham, turned the matter over in his mind, thinking within himself how best he might carry out his project. His intention was to obtain from his cousin an assurance of her love, and a promise that it should not be shaken by any stories which his father might tell respecting him. For this purpose he must make known to her the story of as his father had told him, and his own absolute disbelief in it. Much else must be confided to her. He must acknowledge in part his own debts, and must explain that his father had taken this course in order to defraud his creditors. All this would be very difficult, but he must trust in her innocence and generosity. He thought that the condition of his affairs might be so represented that the story should tend rather to win her heart towards him than to turn it away. Her mother had hitherto always been in his favor, and he had in fact been received almost as an Apollo in the house at Cheltenham. So he's not exactly talking about lying to her, but he wants to put his case in the best possible terms. "Florence," he said, "I must see you alone for a few minutes. I know that your mother will trust me." This was spoken immediately on his arrival, and Mrs. Mountjoy at once left the room. She had been taught to believe that it was her daughter's duty to marry her cousin, and though she knew that the captain had done much to embarrass the property, she thought that this would be the surest way to settle him. The heir of Tretton Park was, in her estimation, so great a man that very much was to be endured at his hands. She has no idea of the extent of his debts. He's not the heir to Tretton Park, effectively. I mean, if he hadn't been delegitimized by his father, Tretton Park and everything connected with it have gone to his debtors, to his creditors, at his father's death. She has no idea of that. The meeting between the two cousins was very long, and when Mrs. Mountjoy at last returned unannounced to the room, she found her daughter in tears. "Oh, Florence, what is the matter?" The poor girl said nothing, but still continued to weep, while the captain stood by, looking black as a thundercloud. He's heard stuff he doesn't like. "What is it, Mountjoy?" said Mrs. Mountjoy, turning to him. "I have told Florence some of my troubles," he said, "and they seem to have changed her mind towards me." That's not true. He's being unfair. That's not what changed her mind. There was something in this which was detestable to Florence, an unfairness, a dishonesty in putting off upon his trouble that absence of love which she had at last been driven by his vows to confess. She knew that it was not because of his present trouble that she understood to be terrible, but which she could not in truth comprehend. He had blurted it all out roughly. The story as told by his father of his mother's dishonor, of his own insignificance in the world, of the threatened loss of the property, of the heaviness of his debts, and added his conviction that his father had invented it all, and was in fact a thorough rascal. The full story of his debts he kept back, not with any predetermined falseness, but because it is so difficult for a man to own that he has absolutely ruined himself by his own folly. It was not wonderful that the girl should not have understood such a story as had been told to her. Why was he defending his mother? Why was he accusing his father? The accusations against her uncle, whom she did not know, were more fearful to her than these mysterious charges against her aunt, whom she did not know, from which her son defended her. But then he had spoken passionately of his own love, and she had understood that. He had besought her to confess that she loved him, and then she had at once become stubborn. There was something in the word confess which grated against her feelings. It seemed to imply a conviction on his part that she did love him. She had never told him so, and was now sure that it was not so. When he had pressed her, she could only weep, and in her weeping she never for a moment yielded. She never uttered a single word on which he could be enabled to build a hope. Then he had become blacker and still blacker, fiercer and still fiercer, more and more earnest in his purpose, till at last he had asked her whom it was she loved, as she could not love him. He starts to sense there's someone else. It is amazing, as I said yesterday, it's amazing to look at the manuscript of this and see these words just pouring out like this. No corrections, no revisions, almost. He knew well whom it was that he suspected, and she knew also. We don't know, Tony. You might give us a hint. You will. We'll learn all about it. We'll learn all about the other man. But he had no right to demand any statement from her on that head. She did not think that the man loved her, nor did she know what to say or to think of her own feelings. Were he, the other man, to come to her, she would only bid him go away. But why she should so bid him, she hardly known. But now this dark, frowning captain, with his big mustache and his military look and his general aspect of invincible power, threatened the other man. He came to Tretton as my friend, he said, and by heaven, if he stands in my way, if he dare cross between you and me, he shall answer it with his life. So whoever this other man is, he's well known to Mountjoy Scarborough. He's been to Tretton Park. All will be revealed. You just have to wait. That's all. Keep in mind, this was serialized. Part of the goal of this is to make you want to learn what happens next. The name had not been mentioned, but this had been very terrible to Florence, and she could only weep. He went away, refusing to stay to dinner, but said that on the following afternoon he would again return. In the street of the town he met one of his creditors, who had discovered his journey to Cheltenham and followed him. He's got lots of creditors, and they don't want to let him go. And they're not scrupulous either. They will embarrass him anywhere. And this is the other point of the chapter that we need to address. First one was everybody enthusiastically cheering on the marriage of first cousins. The second one is the creditors, many of whom are Jews. And this is the 19th century. This is the early 1880s. Trollope is writing about them exactly in the manner of the time. And it's grating. It's prejudice. It's bigoted. It's often ugly. I said yesterday that I don't believe that it's animated, that it's an active bigotry. A lot of you wrote to me about that. Wonderful. I'd forgotten completely how wonderful a group I have fallen in with here. The emails I'm getting, the Voxer messages I'm getting are wonderful. A lot of you wrote to me saying, well, you love this author. Isn't it possible that you're granting him too much credit? Some of what we've seen, even in the other stuff you've read us, seems pretty ugly towards the Jews. Is it possible that you're just giving him too much credit? It is. It is possible, I suppose. I could make an argument, but I can argue for anything. So can you. And this encounter, it makes it impossible to defend him. We're just going to have to deal with stuff like this. And we'll talk about it from time to time. But let's get this little interview with the creditor out of the way. Oh, Captain Mountjoy, what is all dis, D-I-S? The Yiddish accent. What is all dis they are talking about in London? What are they talking about? The inheritance, said the man, who was a veritable Jew, looking up anxiously in his face. So he's little, talks with the Yiddish accent. He's a veritable Jew. Painful. Even if you're on Trollope's side, that's painful. The man had his acceptance for a very large sum of money, with an assurance that it should be paid on his father's death, for which he had given him about £2,000 in cash. So we're not talking about banks here, remember, and we're not talking about finance laws. Montjoy got £2,000 in ready money from this guy, cash on the barrelhead, not a promissory note, cash in his pocket, for the promise of a whole lot more than that. You must ask my father. But is it true? You must ask my father. Upon my word, I can tell you nothing else. He has concocted a tale, which I, for one, do not believe a word. I never heard of the story till he condescended to tell it me the other day. Whether it be true or false, you and I, Mr. Hart, are in the same boat. But you have had the money, and you have got the bill. It's not a fair exchange. Yeah, right. He has a bill, but Montjoy got cash. Bill is worthless now. You can't do anything by coming after me. My father seems to have contrived a very clever plan by which he can rob you, but he will rob me at the same time. Montjoy's right. You may believe me or not as you please, but that you will find to be the truth. Then Mr. Hart left him, but certainly did not believe a word the captain had said to him. And here, this is just the first little installment of this. A lot of these creditors will not be so easily dismissed. Mr. Hart hears this and leaves him. Totally unsatisfying. And he doesn't believe it. Obviously here, the thing he doesn't believe is that he thinks Montjoy is in on it with his father. To her mother, Florence would only disclose her persistent intention of not marrying her cousin. Mrs. Montjoy, over whose spirit the glamour of the captain's prestige was still potent, said much in his favor. Everybody had always intended the marriage, and it would be the setting right of everything. The captain, no doubt, owed a large sum of money, but that would be paid by Florence's fortune. Fortune would be eaten up in 2 seconds. So little did the poor lady know of the captain's condition. When she had been told that there had been a great quarrel between the captain and his father, she had declared that the marriage would set all right. But, Mamma, Captain Scarborough was not to have the property at all. Then Mrs. Montjoy, believing thoroughly in entails, had declared that all heaven could not prevent it. But that makes no difference, said the daughter. If I loved him, I would marry him so much the more if he had nothing. Florence has read too many novels out of Moody's, I think. Then Mrs. Montjoy declared that she could not understand it at all. Probably left the room. None of this makes any sense to her. No, I don't know what you mean. You're going to marry him. That will settle him down. He'll inherit Tretton Park, and everything will be fine. On the next Sunday, Captain Scarborough came, according to his promise, but said nothing that he could say nothing he could say would induce Florence to come into his presence. She stays in her room. Her mother declared that she was so ill that it would be wicked to disturb her. So they don't have a subsequent interview. That is the end of chapter 2, in which we have that horrible moment with the moneylender. We're just going to have to live with the anti-Semitism that's in this book. If it is explicit, active, mocking anti-Semitism, I'm just going to have to live with that. We're going to have to live with that. But now we know that there's more to Captain Montjoy than we thought. He has forever been thought of as the intended of his first cousin, Mr. Scarborough's niece. But that has only been the family tradition. Nothing has been said explicitly. In order to explain himself and what the rumors that Florence Montjoy is going to hear, Montjoy has to tell her a lot of specifics. And the only motivation that he has to tell her lots of specifics is to get a declaration of love, something they've never spoken of openly before. And that's when he learns that that's not forthcoming because there's someone else. There's another man. Her heart is elsewhere. So we learn a lot in this chapter. And again, I won't stress this anymore, but Trollope told us at the beginning of this book that basically I'm going to have to bore you with background for the first 4 chapters. He doesn't do that. This is great. This is great stuff. So we're going to move on. Going to move on to the next chapter next time when we will meet the other man. So I will wrap this up for now. I will see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.